The rain hammered against the windows of Central Hospital like bullets against concrete, each drop a harsh reminder that nothing about this Friday night was going according to plan. I pressed my fingers against my temples, fighting back the headache that had become my constant companion over the past 18 hours. The ICU smelled of antiseptic and desperation, a cocktail I'd grown accustomed to during my 4 years as a nurse here. But tonight the metallic scent of blood seemed thicker, more suffocating. "Montenegro, you're up," Dr. Patel called from behind the nurse's station, not bothering to look up from his tablet. His voice carried that particular exhaustion that came with emergency situations stretching far beyond their expected duration. "Room 314. Auto accident victim. Stable, but needs observation." I rubbed my burning eyes and glanced at the wall clock. 2:30 in the morning. What should have been a 12-hour shift had stretched into 18 hours of chaos after a multi-car pileup on the interstate brought wave after wave of trauma patients through our doors. My scrub stuck to my skin with sweat and anxiety, my dark hair escaping its ponytail in rebellious strands that framed my face. "What's the situation?" I asked, taking the chart from Dr. Patel's outstretched hand. My voice sounded hoarser than usual, scratchy from breathing recycled hospital air for too many consecutive hours. "Minor injuries. Some stitches needed. Nothing complicated. Just keep an eye on vitals and make sure he's comfortable." Dr. Patel finally looked up, his expression softening slightly when he noticed the dark circles under my eyes. "After this one, you can head home, Montenegro. You've done enough for tonight." I nodded gratefully, though part of me wondered if I'd even be able to drive safely. My 26-year-old body felt decades older as I made my way down the dimly lit corridor, past rooms filled with patients who'd been luckier than they knew. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, creating an almost strobing effect that made my exhaustion-induced headache throb harder. Room 314 sat at the end of the hallway, its door slightly ajar. I knocked twice before pushing it open, my mind already running through the routine checks I'd need to perform, but nothing could have prepared me for what waited inside. The scene before me looked like something from a movie rather than a hospital room. 2 men in dark suits stood guard on either side of a hospital bed, their postures rigid as soldiers at attention. Both wore sunglasses despite being indoors at nearly 3 in the morning, their faces expressionless masks that revealed nothing. Medical equipment I didn't recognize hummed quietly in the corner, far more sophisticated than our standard issue machines. On the bed sat a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Even injured, even vulnerable in a hospital gown that should have diminished his presence, he radiated an authority that made my breath catch in my throat. Dark hair, slightly mussed, framed a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, sharp cheekbones, strong jawline, eyes the color of winter storms. A white bandage wrapped around his shoulder, stark against olive skin that spoke of Mediterranean heritage, but it was his eyes that stopped me cold. Ice blue and penetrating, they fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. This wasn't the grateful look of a typical patient, or the pain-clouded gaze of someone fighting injury. This was the stare of a predator, calculating and completely alert despite whatever trauma had brought him here. "I requested a doctor," he said, his voice low and accented with something that sent shivers down my spine. "Italian, maybe, or some blend of languages that spoke of old money and older power." Each word was precisely pronounced, as if he'd learned English from professors rather than the streets. I straightened my shoulders, trying to project the confidence that 4 years of nursing had taught me to fake when necessary. "I'm Sophia, your nurse for tonight. I'm fully qualified to handle your care." One of the suited men stepped forward slightly, and I caught the unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. My mouth went dry, but I held my ground. In 4 years of working emergency medicine, I'd seen gang members, drug dealers, and criminals of every stripe. I'd learned to project calm, even when my heart hammered against my ribs. The patient on the bed studied me for a long moment, his gaze moving from my face down to my hands and back again. "You're tired," he observed. Not a question, but a statement. "How many hours have you been working?" "Long enough to know how to do my job," I replied, moving closer to check his chart. "Let me take a look at that shoulder." "Leave us," he said suddenly, addressing the men in suits. For a moment, I thought he was speaking to me, but the guards exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "Sir, we should— now." One word, spoken quietly, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The two men filed out without another protest, leaving me alone with a patient who clearly wasn't used to being denied anything. I approached the bed cautiously, my nursing instincts warring with an inexplicable sense of danger. "What happened to your shoulder?" He watched me with those unsettling eyes as I reached for the bandage. "Does it matter? It helps me assess the risk of complications." I peeled back the dressing carefully, revealing a neat line of sutures that looked professionally done. Not the work of our emergency room staff. "This is excellent surgical work. Who treated you?" "Someone discreet." His gaze never left my face as I examined the wound. "You have steady hands." The compliment, delivered in that low, accented voice, sent heat creeping up my neck. I focused on the medical assessment, noting the healing was progressing well with minimal inflammation. "The sutures look good. No signs of infection." As I worked, I became acutely aware of his proximity, the heat radiating from his skin, the way he never looked away from me. Most patients either watched the ceiling or winced when I handled their injuries. This man studied me like I was a puzzle he intended to solve. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. I glanced up from replacing his bandage. "I told you. Sophia." "Sophia what?" Something in his tone made me hesitate. "Montenegro." He repeated it slowly, as if testing the syllables on his tongue. "Sophia Montenegro. 26 years old, I'd guess." "You've been working here how long?" The specificity of his observation sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "How do you—" "Wrong room, sweetheart," he interrupted, his lips curving in what might have been a smile but felt more like a threat. "But now that you're here, I think fate may have intervened." I stepped back from the bed, suddenly aware that the door had closed behind his men when they left. I should go check on other patients. "You've seen too much to simply walk away," he said, his voice still quiet, but carrying an undertone that made my blood run cold. The equipment in this room, my associates, the nature of my injuries, everything that would raise questions if discussed with the wrong people. "I don't know anything," I said quickly. "I'm just a nurse doing my job." He sat up straighter, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his sutures. "You have steady hands and kind eyes, Sophia Montenegro. Exactly what I need." His gaze intensified. "Tell me, how much do you love your job here? Enough to work 18-hour shifts that leave you swaying on your feet?" The accuracy of his assessment unnerved me. "What do you want?" "For now, your discretion." He reached into a drawer beside the bed, pulling out what looked like a business card. "But I suspect we'll be seeing each other again very soon." Before I could respond, the door opened and his men returned, moving with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to following orders without question. The patient nodded once toward me. "She stays until I'm discharged. Find out everything about her." The words hit me like a physical blow. As one of the suited men moved toward me, I realized that walking into the wrong room had just changed my life in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. The man on the bed watched my reaction with satisfaction, as if my fear was exactly what he'd been hoping to see. "Everything," he repeated, his winter storm eyes never leaving mine. Saturday morning arrived like a slap of cold reality. I'd barely managed 3 hours of sleep after my shift ended, and even then, my dreams had been haunted by ice-blue eyes and voices that commanded absolute obedience. The knock on my apartment door at 6 a.m. made my blood freeze. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men in expensive suits standing in my hallway like they owned the building. One held a manila envelope, the other kept his hands clasped behind his back, in a pose that screamed military training. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, leaving the chain latch engaged. "Sophia Montenegro?" The taller one spoke with the same crisp professionalism I'd encountered at the hospital. "Who's asking?" "Mr. Toretti requests your presence for breakfast. His car is waiting downstairs. Alessandro Toretti." So now I had a last name to go with the face that had been burned into my memory. I glanced at the clock on my microwave. It's 6 a.m. Mr. Toretti is an early riser. The envelope slid through the gap in my door. "Your employment offer, Miss Montenegro. Mr. Toretti felt you might prefer to review the terms in private before making your decision." My fingers shook as I opened the envelope. The letterhead was embossed, expensive, the kind of stationery that whispered of old money and older power. But it was the numbers that made my vision blur. $50,000 per month, plus benefits, plus immediate signing bonus of $100,000. I read the figure 3 times before my brain could process it. In a year, I'd make more than I'd made in my entire 4-year nursing career combined. There must be some mistake, I whispered. No mistake. Mr. Toretti values exceptional medical care. The position would be as his personal nurse, with housing provided on his estate. Your current debts would be cleared immediately, and your sister's remaining tuition would be covered in full. My sister Lucia. How could he possibly know about my sister's college expenses? The crushing weight of her nursing school loans that kept me working double shifts, eating ramen for weeks at a time, choosing between gas money and groceries. I need time to think. Of course, Mr. Toretti is waiting downstairs to discuss the details. He's a patient man, but he prefers not to wait long. The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. I threw on jeans and a sweater, my mind racing as I descended the 5 flights of stairs. My building's lobby, usually empty at this hour, felt different with a figure in a tailored coat standing near the entrance. Alessandro Toretti looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a magazine. The hospital gown had been replaced by charcoal wool and Italian leather, his dark hair styled with casual perfection. The shoulder I'd bandaged showed no sign of injury as he turned toward me, those winter storm eyes cataloging my appearance with unsettling intensity. Sophia. My name sounded different in his accented voice, like he was claiming ownership of it. I trust you slept well? Not particularly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Neither did I. Shall we? The car waiting outside was a black Mercedes that cost more than I'd make in 2 years. As he held the door open, I caught the subtle scent of expensive cologne, mixed with something darker. More dangerous. The interior was cream leather and polished wood, a mobile office that spoke of a man who conducted business everywhere he went. As we pulled away from my rundown neighborhood, Alessandro poured coffee from a silver thermos into bone china cups. Have you had a chance to review the employment terms? I clutched my purse, the contract folded inside like a loaded weapon. The salary is generous. I pay for the best. His eyes never left my face as he handed me the coffee. Tell me, Sophia, what do you know about my family? The careful way he said family sent warnings racing along my spine. Nothing. Refreshing honesty. He settled back against the leather seats. The Toretti family has been in business for 3 generations. We value loyalty, discretion, and competence above all else. The car turned onto roads I'd never seen before, away from the city and into areas where houses became estates, where privacy was measured in acres rather than thin apartment walls. Trees lined the drive as we passed through wrought iron gates that whispered open at our approach. What kind of business? I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Import and export, real estate development, investment management. Each word was precisely chosen, revealing nothing while confirming everything. The kind of business that sometimes requires medical discretion. The mansion that came into view took my breath away. Not ostentatious like a nouveau riche display, but elegant in the way that only old money could achieve. Stone and glass merged seamlessly, surrounded by gardens that probably employed more staff than my entire hospital floor. This is your home? One of them. He opened his door as we stopped under a covered portico. Come, I'd like to show you what you'd be protecting. The interior was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, artwork that belonged in museums, ceilings that soared toward skylights that bathed everything in natural light. A woman in her 50s appeared, dressed in a simple uniform, but carrying herself with quiet authority. This is Mrs. Chen, my head of household staff, Alessandro explained. Mrs. Chen, Miss Montenegro will be joining us for breakfast. The older woman's eyes assessed me with the efficiency of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly. A pleasure, Miss Montenegro. Breakfast is served on the terrace whenever you're ready. As we walked through rooms that each cost more than most people's houses, Alessandro spoke casually about the property. The gym, the library, the medical wing that was better equipped than some small hospitals. But it was his study that revealed the most about the man I was dealing with. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on business, philosophy, Military strategy. Behind an enormous desk sat a high-backed leather chair that looked like a throne, but it was the photographs that caught my attention, family portraits spanning decades. Men who shared Alessandro's sharp features and calculating eyes. 3 generations, he said, noticing my interest. My grandfather came from Sicily with nothing but ambition and a strong back. My father expanded our reach along the eastern seaboard, and now it falls to me to secure our future. On the terrace, a table had been set with fine china and crystal glasses that caught the morning light like prisms. The view stretched across manicured lawns toward distant mountains, peaceful and serene in a way that made the danger I sensed feel like imagination. Alessandro held out my chair like a gentleman, but his touch at my elbow sent electricity racing up my arm. The position I'm offering comes with certain requirements, Sophia. Absolute discretion being paramount. What exactly would my duties involve? He poured orange juice that probably cost more per glass than I made per hour. General medical care, wound treatment, monitoring health conditions that require privacy. Nothing beyond your current skill set. The way he said privacy made it clear that his medical needs wouldn't be found in any textbook. The salary you're offering is 10 times what I make now. What aren't you telling me? For the first time since I'd met him, Alessandro's expression shifted to something that might have been respect. You're intelligent. Good. Intelligence is a quality I value highly. He set down his glass with deliberate care. 3 families saw cars leaving that hospital room last night, Sophia. You've been marked as someone connected to me, whether you choose to be or not. The breakfast suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. Marked how? My world operates on perception and reputation. The fact that I allowed you to leave that room alive means something to people who make their living reading between lines. His voice remained calm, conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than my potential death sentence. You're safer under my protection than trying to pretend last night never happened. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against stone. You're saying I don't have a choice. You always have choices, Sophia. But some choices come with consequences you might not survive. Alessandro stood as well, his height casting a shadow across my face. I'm offering you a solution that benefits us both. You get financial security beyond your wildest dreams, and I get a medical professional I can trust implicitly. And if I refuse, his smile was sharp as a blade, then I wish you the best of luck returning to your previous life, though I should mention that your sister Lucia is entering her final semester at St. Mary's College of Nursing. Excellent school, expensive tuition. The threat was so subtle it took me a moment to recognize it. Not against Lucia directly, but the implication that my refusal might affect her future hung in the air like smoke. You've researched my family. I research everyone who enters my life, however briefly. Alessandro moved closer, close enough that I caught the warmth radiating from his skin. You have $47,000 in student debt, Sophia. Your sister has $38,000 remaining on her loans. Your rent is 3 months behind, and you've been living on coffee and whatever you can grab from the hospital cafeteria for the past 2 weeks. Each fact hit like a physical blow. The complete invasion of my privacy, the casual way he discussed details of my life that I'd never shared with anyone. How? It's remarkable what public records can reveal to someone with the right connections. His hand touched my cheek, fingers tracing the line of exhaustion I knew marked my face. You're killing yourself trying to keep your head above water, Principessa. I'm offering you a lifeboat. The endearment, spoken in that low, accented voice, sent heat racing through my veins despite my fear. I need time to consider. Of course. Alessandro stepped back, giving me space to breathe. Take the weekend. Mrs. Chen has prepared the guest cottage for your use while you decide. Your things have already been moved from your apartment. My mouth fell open. You moved my belongings without permission? I moved them for safekeeping. As I said, you've been marked. Your apartment is being watched by people far less patient than I am. Before I could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared as if summoned by telepathy. Miss Montenegro, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your quarters. Your sister called to confirm she received the tuition payment. The world tilted beneath my feet. What tuition payment? Alessandro's smile was answer enough. Lucia's final semester, paid in full, while I'd been eating breakfast and pretending I had choices. Monday morning, Sophia, he said as Mrs. Chen waited patiently. I'll need your answer by Monday morning. as I followed the housekeeper toward what would either become my salvation or my beautiful prison. I realized that Alessandro Toretti hadn't been offering me a job at all. He'd been informing me of my new reality. Monday morning arrived with the weight of an ultimatum hanging over my head like a sword. I'd spent the weekend pacing the guest cottage, a luxurious space that felt more like a gilded prison with its marble countertops and silk curtains. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was debating my future while surrounded by more luxury than I'd seen in my entire 26 years. At precisely 7 o'clock, there was a soft knock on the cottage door. Not the demanding pound I'd expected, but the polite rap of someone who didn't need to force entry because they already owned everything inside. Mrs. Chen stood on the threshold, her expression neutral, but her eyes kind. "Good morning, Miss Montenegro. Mr. Toretti requests that you join him for breakfast. I haven't made my decision yet. He's aware of that. He simply wishes to discuss the morning routine you would follow, should you accept his offer." The careful way she phrased it made it clear that refusing wasn't truly an option. I'd already learned that Alessandro Toretti was a man who preferred the illusion of choice to outright coercion, but the end result was the same. I dressed carefully in jeans and a sweater from my hastily packed belongings, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. The main house was already humming with quiet activity servants moving through corridors with the efficiency of people who understood that their employer valued competence above all else. Alessandro waited in a breakfast room I hadn't seen during my previous visit, smaller and more intimate than the formal dining room. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens, where men in suits maintained strategic positions among the roses. Even his landscapers were armed. "Sophia." He rose as I entered, that simple courtesy somehow more unsettling than if he'd remained seated. "I trust you slept well in the cottage. As well as someone can when they're being held prisoner." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You're not a prisoner. You're a guest who happens to have information that could get her killed if she returns to her previous life." He held out my chair, and I caught the scent of his cologne mixed with something else, coffee, expensive soap, and an underlying hint of danger that seemed to cling to him like smoke. "Tell me about the morning routine," I said, settling into the chair and trying to ignore the way his fingers brushed my shoulder as he pushed it in. Alessandro poured coffee from a silver pot, his movements precise and controlled. "I wake at 5:30. Physical training until 6:15, shower, then breakfast. You would join me at 7 to review any medical concerns for the day." "What kind of medical concerns?" "I suffer from chronic insomnia. Stress-related tension that sometimes manifests as severe headaches. Occasional injuries that require discreet treatment." His blue eyes met mine over the rim of his cup. "The shoulder wound you treated was not unusual." The casual way he discussed getting shot made my stomach clench. "How often do you require treatment for injuries?" "Often enough that having a qualified medical professional on staff is a necessity rather than a luxury." Alessandro set down his cup with deliberate care. "Tell me, Sophia, what do you know about my family's business?" The question I'd been dreading since Saturday morning. "Import and export, real estate development, investment management. All true, as far as they go." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those unsettling eyes. "But incomplete. My family operates in spaces where traditional legal remedies are insufficient. We provide solutions to problems that the authorities either can't or won't address." "You're talking about organized crime." "I'm talking about order in places where chaos would otherwise reign." Alessandro's voice remained calm, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than illegal activities. 3 generations of Torettis have built something that provides stability and prosperity for hundreds of families. That kind of legacy requires certain practical approaches to problem solving. A woman in uniform appeared silently to refill our coffee cups and place a plate of pastries between us. She moved with the same quiet efficiency I'd noticed in all of Alessandro's staff. There one moment, and gone the next. "And if I can't accept that kind of work, then you're free to leave." Alessandro reached across the table, his fingers touching mine with surprising gentleness. "But understand that the world you'd be returning to is one where your connection to me makes you a target, where your sister's safety depends on factors beyond my control." The threat was so softly spoken it took me a moment to recognize it. Not a direct promise of harm, but a reminder that protection could be withdrawn as easily as it had been offered. I pulled my hand free, needing the distance to think clearly. What would my actual duties involve? General medical care, wound treatment, monitoring chronic conditions, medication management. Alessandro's gaze never left my face. Absolute discretion regarding everything you see, hear, or treat. No reports to authorities. No documentation that could be subpoenaed. Precisely. The breakfast suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. Everything I'd been trained to do as a nurse ran counter to what he was asking. Documentation was patient safety. Reporting suspicious injuries was the law. What he wanted was complicity in covering up violence. I need to think about this. Of course. Alessandro stood as I pushed back from the table. Mrs. Chen will show you to the medical wing. I'd like you to see what you'd be working with. The medical wing was more sophisticated than some hospitals where I'd worked. An examination room with equipment that probably cost more than my annual salary. A surgery suite that could have performed complex procedures. A pharmacy stocked with everything from basic antibiotics to controlled substances that would require DEA licenses to possess legally. Impressive, I admitted, running my hands over a cardiac monitor that was newer than anything at Central Hospital. I invest in the best. Alessandro appeared behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. The question is whether you're willing to be part of that investment. I turned to face him, suddenly aware that we were alone in a soundproof room far from any potential witnesses. And if I say no, then I wish you luck, Principessa. The endearment sent heat racing through my veins despite my fear. But I should mention that your apartment building experienced a break-in yesterday evening. Nothing taken, but your unit was specifically targeted. My blood turned to ice. What? 3 men. Professional. They spent considerable time going through your personal belongings before my security team convinced them to leave. Alessandro's voice remained calm. Matter of fact, the superintendent has been compensated for the damage, and new locks have been installed. But the message was clear. What message? That your connection to me has been noted by people who lack my patience and respect for innocent civilians. His hand touched my cheek, fingers tracing the line of my jaw. You're safer here, Sophia, whether you work for me or not. The touch was gentle, almost tender, completely at odds with the implications of his words. I should have pulled away, should have been terrified by this man who spoke so casually of violence and danger. Instead, I found myself leaning into the contact, craving the comfort of human warmth in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. My sister, I whispered, is being watched by a security team that makes the Secret Service look like mall cops. Alessandro's thumb brushed across my lower lip, and I couldn't suppress the shiver that ran through me. Nothing will happen to Lucia as long as you're under my protection. The implication was clear. My sister's safety was contingent on my cooperation. But looking into his eyes, I realized something that should have terrified me more than any threat. I was beginning to trust him. 1 month, I heard myself saying. I'll try it for 1 month. Alessandro's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. That's all I ask, Principessa. 1 month to show you what life can be like when you don't have to worry about money, safety, or the future. As he leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear, I realized that Alessandro Toretti hadn't just offered me a job. He'd offered me a place in his world, with all the luxury and danger that entailed. And despite every instinct screaming that I was making a terrible mistake, I found myself wondering what it would feel like to belong somewhere for the first time in years. Even if that somewhere happened to be the empire of a man who could destroy me with a whisper, the cottage suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. And that realization was more terrifying than anything he'd said about enemies or break-ins, because it meant I was already beginning to fall under the spell of Alessandro Toretti, and I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to resist. Friday arrived with an edge of tension that had been building all week. I'd settled into the routine of Alessandro's world with disturbing ease, checking his blood pressure each morning, monitoring the healing of various minor wounds, administering medications for the chronic insomnia that kept him pacing his study until the early hours. But there was something different about this particular morning, an undercurrent of urgency that made the staff move with heightened efficiency. Alessandro was waiting in the breakfast room when I arrived at 7, but instead of his usual composed demeanor, he was speaking rapidly into his phone in Italian. The words were too fast for me to follow. but the tone was unmistakably tense. When he saw me, he ended the call with a sharp command and set the phone aside. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "I may need medical attention today, and I wanted to prepare you." My stomach tightened. What kind of situation? The kind where my diplomatic approach has failed, and more direct methods become necessary. Alessandro's ice-blue eyes met mine across the table. 3 families have been pressuring me for weeks about territory disputes. Today, we resolve those disputes permanently. The casual way he discussed violence still unsettled me, even after a week of living in his world. "Are you expecting to be injured?" "I'm expecting that not everyone will survive the day." His hand touched mine across the table, fingers warm against my suddenly cold skin. "But I have an advantage they don't know about." "Which is?" "A highly skilled medical professional who can patch me up without asking inconvenient questions." Alessandro's smile was sharp as a blade. "Stay close to your phone today, Principessa. I may need you on short notice." The endearment sent heat racing through my veins despite my fear. Over the past week, I'd found myself looking forward to these morning conversations, to the way his eyes tracked my movements, to the careful way he touched my hand or shoulder when reviewing his medical files. It was dangerous territory, and I knew it. At precisely noon, my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. "Medical emergency. Come to Warehouse District. Address attached. Bring everything." I'd prepared for this moment all week, keeping a medical kit stocked with trauma supplies, blood products, even surgical instruments that shouldn't have been available outside a hospital setting. The car that waited for me was one I'd seen before, but the man behind the wheel was someone new, a driver whose knuckles bore the telltale scars of someone who'd learned to fight with his hands. The Warehouse District was a maze of abandoned buildings and empty lots, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry and blood could be washed away without questions. We pulled up to a nondescript building where men in suits stood guard, their positions strategic enough to control all approaches. Inside, the warehouse had been converted into something that looked like a cross between a conference room and an interrogation chamber. Tables, chairs, and in the center of the space, Alessandro stood with 2 other men, all of them wearing expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the tension radiating from their bodies. But it was the 4th man that made me freeze. He sat tied to a chair, blood streaming from his nose, his expensive suit torn and stained. Even injured, even humiliated, there was something about his posture that suggested he was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "Sophia," Alessandro's voice cut through my shock. "Meet Viktor Petrov. He's the reason your apartment was broken into last week." The Russian accent was thick when Petrov spoke, his words slurred by what was obviously a broken jaw. "So this is the little nurse who has captured Alessandro's attention. Pretty thing. I can see the appeal." Alessandro moved with fluid grace, his fist connecting with Petrov's temple hard enough to snap the man's head sideways. "You'll speak respectfully of my medical staff, or you won't speak at all." The casual violence should have horrified me. Instead, I found myself studying Petrov's injuries with clinical detachment, cataloging the damage and mentally reviewing treatment protocols. When had I become someone who could watch a man being tortured and think only of medical procedures? "The photographs," Alessandro continued, his voice conversational despite the circumstances. "The ones your men took of Sophia at the hospital, at her apartment, following her to work. I'd like to know who else has seen them." Petrov spat blood onto the concrete floor. "Many people. Insurance, you might say." Alessandro's expression didn't change, but I saw the subtle shift in his stance, the way his shoulders tensed. "How many people, Victor?" "Enough that killing me solves nothing. The girl is marked, Toretti. She belongs to my organization now, whether she knows it or not." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marked. Belonged to them. I'd known intellectually that my connection to Alessandro put me in danger, but hearing it spoken so casually made it real in a way that turned my knees to water. Alessandro moved closer to where I stood, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Nobody owns Sofia Montenegro except Sofia Montenegro. But since you seem to have forgotten how respect works, let me remind you." What happened next was swift and brutal. Alessandro moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned violence as a survival skill, his hands finding pressure points that dropped Petrov into unconsciousness without causing permanent damage. Professional, controlled, terrifying. He'll wake up in a few hours with nothing more than a headache, Alessandro said, straightening his suit jacket as if he'd been discussing the weather. But the message will be clear to anyone watching. I stared at the unconscious man, my medical training warring with the reality of what I'd just witnessed. Is he going to be all right? He's alive, which is more consideration than he showed when he ordered surveillance on you. Alessandro's hand touched my face, fingers tracing the line of my jaw. You're under my protection now, Sophia. That means something in this world. The warehouse around us was being efficiently cleaned, evidence of what had transpired disappearing as if it had never happened. Men moved with the same quiet competence I'd observed at the estate, every action coordinated and purposeful. The other families, I asked, have been convinced that territorial expansion in certain directions would be unwise. Alessandro's smile was satisfied. Predatory. Sometimes diplomacy requires a demonstration of strength. As we walked back to the car, I realized that the morning's events had changed something fundamental between us. I'd seen Alessandro in his element, watched him exercise the kind of power that built empires and destroyed lives. And instead of running, instead of demanding to be taken back to my cottage to pack my belongings, I found myself walking closer to him, craving the security of his presence. Are you all right? He asked, as we settled into the back seat of the car. I should be horrified, I said honestly. I should be demanding that you take me home, that you let me go back to my old life. But you're not. No. I met his gaze directly. I'm not. And that scares me more than anything that happened in there. Alessandro's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine, in a gesture that felt more intimate than any kiss. Fear can be useful, Principessa. It keeps you alive. But don't fear what's growing between us. The car pulled away from the warehouse district, carrying us back toward the estate and the life that was becoming less temporary with each passing day. In the distance, I could see smoke rising from what might have been another warehouse. And I didn't ask what was burning. Some questions were better left unasked, especially when the answers might reveal how much I'd already changed, how completely I was falling under the spell of a man who could destroy lives with a whisper and then hold my hand with surprising gentleness. The day's violence had been a test, I realized, not of my medical skills, but of my ability to accept the reality of Alessandro's world. And despite every instinct that should have been screaming warnings, I'd passed that test with flying colors, which meant I was in far more danger than I'd ever imagined, because the greatest threat wasn't from his enemies. It was from the way I was beginning to feel about the man who claimed to be protecting me. Monday morning arrived with a weight I hadn't expected. I'd been living at Alessandro's estate for over 2 weeks now, and what had started as a temporary arrangement was beginning to feel disturbingly permanent. The luxury no longer impressed me. Instead, it had become the backdrop for a life I barely recognized as my own. But it was what I discovered that Monday that shattered any illusions I still harbored about the man I was falling for. Alessandro was in meetings all morning, closeted in his study with men whose expensive suits couldn't quite hide the hardness in their eyes. I'd been given strict instructions to stay in the medical wing, reviewing inventory and updating protocols. But restlessness drove me to explore areas of the mansion I hadn't yet seen. The basement level was accessible through a discreet door near the kitchen, and what I found there made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a wine cellar or storage area, it was a command center that rivaled anything I'd seen in spy movies. Banks of monitors showed surveillance feeds from locations throughout the city, communication equipment that looked military-grade, and filing cabinets that stretched along one entire wall. But it was the contents of one particular cabinet that destroyed my world. The files were meticulously organized, each bearing a name written in Alessandro's precise handwriting. And there, near the front, was a folder marked Montenegro, Eduardo, deceased. My father's name. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing photographs I'd never seen before. My father meeting with men I didn't recognize, entering buildings I'd never heard of, conducting business that looked nothing like the simple accounting work he'd claimed to do. But it was the final document in the file that made me sink to my knees on the concrete floor. A death certificate dated 3 years earlier, signed by a coroner I'd never heard of. But beneath it was another document, this one bearing Alessandro's signature, an authorization for permanent resolution of security breach involving Eduardo Montenegro. He'd ordered my father's death, the man I'd been falling for, the man who touched me with such gentleness, who called me Principessa with genuine affection in his voice, had signed the order that killed my father. The car accident that had devastated my family, that had left Lucia and me alone in the world, hadn't been an accident at all. I don't know how long I sat on that floor, staring at the evidence of Alessandro's betrayal. Time seemed suspended, reality fracturing around the edges as I tried to process what I'd discovered. When footsteps finally echoed on the basement stairs, I didn't even try to hide what I'd found. Alessandro appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been regret when he saw the open file in my hands. "You weren't supposed to see that." "But I did." My voice sounded hollow, unrecognizable. "You killed him. You killed my father." Alessandro moved closer, his hands held out in a gesture that was probably meant to be calming. "Sophia, let me explain." "Explain what?" I stood on unsteady legs, the file clutched against my chest like a shield. "How you murdered an innocent man. How you've been lying to me for weeks. Your father wasn't innocent." Alessandro's voice was quiet, controlled, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Eduardo Montenegro was stealing from 3 different organizations, playing them against each other. He was going to get a lot of people killed. The words hit me like physical blows. "That's not possible." My father was an accountant. He worked for a legitimate firm. "He worked for legitimate firms during the day," Alessandro interrupted. "At night, he was cooking books for money laundering operations, skimming percentages for himself, and selling information to whoever paid the highest price. He was a traitor, Sophia. To everyone." I backed away from him, my spine hitting the filing cabinet. "You're lying." Alessandro reached into another drawer, pulling out a thick folder that made the first one look insignificant. Bank records showing deposits from 7 different criminal organizations. Recordings of phone calls where he's negotiating prices for information. Video surveillance of him meeting with federal agents. He spread the contents across a nearby table. Each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin of the father I thought I'd known. Eduardo Montenegro was planning to disappear with $10 million in stolen money, leaving you and Lucia to face the consequences of his betrayals. I stopped him before he could destroy more lives. The room spun around me as I stared at proof that my entire life had been built on lies. My gentle, hard-working father had been a criminal who'd put his own daughters in danger for money. But that knowledge didn't lessen the pain of Alessandro's deception. "You knew," I whispered. "When you offered me that job, when you brought me here, you knew exactly who I was. This was never about my medical skills or wrong numbers or coincidences. You've been planning this from the beginning." Alessandro's mask of control finally cracked, and I saw something raw and vulnerable in his ice-blue eyes. "At first, yes. I investigated you because of your connection to Eduardo. But when I saw you at that hospital, when I watched you care for your sister, sacrifice everything for her education," his voice broke slightly. "You were nothing like him, Sophia. You were everything good that he pretended to be. So you decided to collect me like a prize?" Anger burned through my shock, white-hot and purifying. "The daughter of the man you murdered, turned into your personal nurse? I decided to protect you from the consequences of his actions." Alessandro stepped closer, and I saw my own pain reflected in his face. 3 organizations were looking for Eduardo's family, believing you might know where he hid the money he stole. I made it clear that you were under my protection, that touching you would mean war with the Toretti family. Before I could respond, the basement door slammed open, and Marco Santini descended the stairs with 2 men I didn't recognize. There was something different about Alessandro's consigliere, something desperate in his usually composed demeanor. "Sophia," Marco said, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "You need to come with me." Alessandro moved between us instantly, his hand reaching inside his jacket for what I knew was a gun. "Explain yourself, Marco. They have my family." Marco's voice cracked. "My wife, my children. 6 months they've been holding them, forcing me to feed information to the Russians. They want her as collateral for your cooperation." The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Marco's recent strange behavior, the way he'd been pushing Alessandro toward more aggressive actions, the timing of everything that had brought me into Alessandro's world. It had all been orchestrated. You set this up, I breathed, staring at Marco. You arranged for me to find that room, didn't you? You made sure I'd see Alessandro's medical equipment, that I'd become involved. Marco's face was a mask of tortured guilt. They needed leverage against him, something he cared about more than territory or money. I watched him watching you for months, saw how you affected him. I thought if I could make the connection seem natural, accidental. Alessandro's gun was in his hand now, trained on the man who'd been his closest advisor for 8 years. Where are they holding your family, Marco? Warehouse district. Same building where we met with Petrov. Marco's hands shook as he held them up in surrender. They'll kill them if I don't bring her, Alessandro. My children are 7 and 9 years old. I looked between the two men, understanding that I was standing at the center of a web of manipulation that stretched back months. Marco had betrayed his closest friend to save his family. Alessandro had built his protection of me on the foundation of my father's murder. Everyone had used me, moved me like a piece on a chessboard, and I'd been too blind to see it. I won't be anyone's leverage, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Not yours, not theirs, not his. I looked directly at Alessandro. I'm leaving. Tonight. I want nothing more to do with any of this. Sophia, please. Alessandro's voice held a desperation I'd never heard before. Let me explain everything. Let me tell you why. Why what? I interrupted. Why you killed my father. Why you manipulated me into caring about you. Why you made me feel safe when I was actually in more danger than I'd ever imagined. Before he could answer, I walked toward the stairs, leaving both men frozen in the basement, surrounded by the evidence of their respective betrayals. Marco called after me. Something about protection and consequences. But I didn't stop. In the medical wing, I gathered my few personal belongings with mechanical efficiency. The luxury clothes Alessandro had provided, the jewelry, the expensive gifts, all of it stayed behind. I wanted nothing that connected me to this world of beautiful lies and deadly truths. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway as I finished packing, her expression unreadable. Miss Montenegro, Mr. Toretti asked me to remind you that your apartment is still being watched. Your sister's safety. Tell Mr. Toretti that I'll take my chances with his enemies rather than stay under the protection of my father's murderer, I said, shouldering my bag. And tell him that if anything happens to Lucia, I'll make sure every law enforcement agency in the country knows exactly where to find him. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear raised voices from the basement. Alessandro and Marco arguing about strategy and family and consequences. But their problems were no longer mine. I'd been Sophia Montenegro, daughter of a man I thought was a saint. Then I'd been Sophia Montenegro, nurse to a dangerous criminal. Now I was just Sophia Montenegro, a woman who'd learned that love built on lies was more dangerous than any enemy, and I was walking away from both the man who'd killed my father and the twisted world that had nearly consumed me. The night air felt like freedom as I stepped outside the mansion's gates, even though I knew it might also be signing my death warrant. But for the first time in weeks, I was making a choice that was entirely my own. 24 hours of freedom had been enough to remind me why I'd accepted Alessandro's protection in the first place. The motel room I'd rented with my last $300 had broken locks, stained carpets, and windows that didn't quite close properly. But worse than the squalid surroundings were the men in dark cars who'd appeared outside within hours of my arrival. I wasn't naive enough to believe they were Alessandro's people. These men had a different energy, something colder and more brutal than the disciplined professionalism of the Toretti family soldiers. When I'd tried to leave for food that afternoon, one had followed me to the corner store, standing close enough that I could smell the cigarettes on his breath and see the scar running from his temple to his jaw. "Pretty little nurse," he'd said in accented English that made my skin crawl. "You are very far from home, da?" I'd bought a package of crackers and a bottle of water with trembling hands, my mind racing through escape routes that all led nowhere. By evening, I understood that Alessandro had been right about one thing: my connection to him had marked me in ways that wouldn't disappear, simply because I'd walked away from his protection. The knock on my motel room door at 9 p.m. was soft, but persistent. Different from the aggressive pounding I'd expected from the Russian surveillance team. When I peered through the grimy peephole, I saw a figure I didn't recognize, a woman with silver-streaked black hair and kind eyes that reminded me of Mrs. Chen. "Who is it?" I called through the door. "My name is Rosa Benedetti. Marco Santini sent me." Marco's name sent ice through my veins. The man who'd betrayed Alessandro, who'd manipulated me into becoming leverage against the only person who'd ever truly protected me. But something in the woman's voice made me crack the door open, leaving the chain latch engaged. "What do you want?" Rosa held up her hands, showing they were empty. "To give you information that might save your life. And Alessandro's." Against every instinct screaming at me to keep the door locked, I let her inside. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, checking the windows and door locks before settling into the room's single chair. "You must be wondering why Marco would send help," she said, her accent carrying hints of old-world Italy. "The truth is, he didn't. I am here because I have been watching his family situation for months, and tonight, events have escalated beyond anything he anticipated. I don't understand." Rosa reached into her purse, withdrawing photographs that made my stomach lurch. A woman with dark hair and terrified eyes, 2 children who couldn't have been older than 10, all of them chained in what looked like a warehouse basement. "Marco's wife and children," Rosa explained. "The Russians have been holding them for 6 months, forcing Marco to feed them information about Alessandro's operations. But they were never planning to release them. Tonight, they gave Marco a final ultimatum: either deliver you to them or watch his family die on live video." The room spun around me as the implications sank in. "He's going to betray Alessandro again. He already has." Rosa's expression was grim. 2 hours ago, Marco told the Russians about Alessandro's location, his security protocols, his medical condition. "They are planning a coordinated attack on the estate tonight, designed to capture both you and Alessandro. But I'm not there anymore. Which is why Marco is now trying to convince Alessandro to meet with him away from the estate's security. He believes if he can deliver Alessandro alone, they might spare his children." Rosa leaned forward. "He is wrong. The Russians plan to kill Marco's family regardless. They have no intention of leaving witnesses." I pressed my hands to my face, trying to process the nightmare that my life had become. "Why are you telling me this? Who are you?" "I am Marco's sister. I've been trying to find his family for months, following the Russians, mapping their operations." Rosa's voice hardened. "Tonight, I located where they are being held. It is a warehouse in the industrial district, the same location where Alessandro met with Viktor Petrov last week." The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. They're using the same location because they know Alessandro has intelligence about its layout. Precisely. They want him to walk into familiar territory where he believes he has advantages. But they have modified the building, added new security measures, turned his knowledge against him. Rosa stood, moving to the window to check the street below. "The men watching you are not just surveillance, Sophia. They are waiting for orders to take you. Marco promised to deliver you before midnight, and when he cannot, they will simply collect you themselves." My phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood freeze. "Unknown number. Message in broken English. 1 hour. Come willing, or we take by force. Your choice." "They know where I am," I whispered. "They have known since you arrived. The question is whether you are going to let Marco's family die while you hide in this room, or if you are going to help me save them and warn Alessandro before he walks into a trap." The moral weight of the choice settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I'd walked away from Alessandro's world, determined never to be anyone's pawn again. But now, 3 innocent children were going to die because of decisions made in that world, and I had the power to stop it. "What's your plan?" Rosa's smile was sharp as a blade. "We save Marco's family first, then we warn Alessandro. But it will require medical skills, knowledge of the warehouse layout, and someone the Russians believe is coming willingly. Me. You." Rosa moved to the door, checking the hallway. "The Russians expect Marco to deliver you within the hour. Instead, you will walk into that warehouse with medical equipment, claiming to be there to treat Alessandro's injuries after they capture him. And then? Then we prove that sometimes the best way to win a war is to be exactly as ruthless as your enemies expect, but twice as smart." As I gathered my medical supplies and prepared to walk back into the world I'd tried to escape, I realized that Rosa was offering me something I'd never had before. The chance to be a true partner, rather than a protected possession. Not Alessandro's principessa or Marco's leverage, but Sofia Montenegro making her own choices about who lived and who died. The Russian surveillance team followed us as we left the motel, just as Rosa had predicted. But they kept their distance, believing I was finally coming willingly to the trap they'd set. What they didn't know was that Rosa had spent months learning their operation, mapping their weaknesses, and preparing for this exact moment. As we drove through the industrial district toward the warehouse where 3 children waited to die, and Alessandro walked unknowingly into an ambush, I understood that this was my real choice, not between safety and danger, but between being a victim of other people's decisions, or becoming someone who shaped the outcome herself. For the first time since I'd discovered that file in Alessandro's basement, I felt like Sofia Montenegro again. Not the daughter of a murdered criminal or the prized possession of a mafia boss, but a woman with steady hands and the courage to use them when lives hung in the balance. The warehouse district at midnight looked like something from a noir film, all shadows and industrial decay lit by sparse streetlights that created more darkness than illumination. Rosa had mapped the building's modifications over the past week, and her intelligence was terrifyingly comprehensive. The Russians had turned the space into a fortress, with new steel reinforcement, electronic surveillance, and strategic choke points designed to funnel intruders into killing zones. But they hadn't counted on someone walking in the front door. I clutched my medical bag tighter as Rosa and I approached the main entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. I would present myself as Alessandro's personal medical staff, claiming to be there to treat him after his capture. Rosa would slip in through the service entrance she'd identified during her reconnaissance. 2 guards flanked the main door, both carrying assault rifles with the casual familiarity of men who'd used them often. They straightened as we approached, their eyes tracking our movement with predatory attention. "You are the nurse?" The larger one spoke with a thick Russian accent, his English carefully pronounced but heavily inflected. "Marco Santini. He said you would come." "I'm here to provide medical treatment," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I understand there may be injuries that require immediate attention." The second guard spoke rapidly into a radio, receiving confirmation before stepping aside. "Boss wants to see you first. Leave bag here." "The medical supplies stay with me," I said, channeling every ounce of authority I'd learned from years of dealing with difficult patients and demanding doctors. "If you want professional medical care, you don't separate a nurse from her equipment." The guards exchanged glances before the first one shrugged. "Dmitri will escort you. Try nothing stupid, little nurse. Many people die tonight if you cause problems." Inside, the warehouse had been transformed into something that resembled a military command center. Banks of monitors showed various angles of the surrounding streets, while armed men positioned themselves at strategic intervals throughout the space. In the center, a man I recognized from surveillance photos as Viktor Petrov sat behind a table laden with communication equipment. But it was what I saw in the far corner that made my blood run cold. Marco's family, 3 figures huddled together in a makeshift cage, the woman and children barely visible in the shadows. They were alive, but their posture spoke of weeks of captivity and terror. "The famous Sofia Montenegro," Petrov said without looking up from his monitors. "Marco has told us so much about you. How you turned Alessandro Toretti from a calculating businessman into a lovesick fool. I'm here to provide medical treatment," I repeated. "Nothing more." "Oh, but you are so much more than that, little nurse." Petrov finally raised his eyes to meet mine, and I saw the cold intelligence that had built his criminal empire. "You are the key to breaking a man who has never shown weakness, never compromised, never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment." Before I could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the building. Red lights flashed as voices shouted in Russian, and suddenly the warehouse erupted into controlled chaos. On the monitors, I could see vehicles approaching from multiple directions, black SUVs and tactical trucks moving with military precision. "Alessandro," Petrov breathed, his expression shifting from satisfaction to something approaching respect. 30 minutes early and coming from directions we did not anticipate. The man learns quickly, but as I watched the feeds, I realized Alessandro wasn't just arriving early, he was arriving in force. The vehicles weren't approaching cautiously. They were racing toward the building with the kind of speed that spoke of assault rather than negotiation, and there were far more of them than Petrov had expected. "Sir," one of the Russian soldiers called out. "Perimeter teams report at least 40 vehicles. This is not a negotiation force." Petrov's face darkened as the implications became clear. He knows about Marco's betrayal. This is not rescue. This is war. The first explosions came from the warehouse's east wall, precisely placed charges that blew strategic holes in the building's structure. Through the smoke and debris, figures in tactical gear poured through the breaches with professional efficiency. But these weren't Alessandro's usual suited soldiers. These were men who moved like military special forces, armed with equipment that spoke of serious preparation. "How many men does he have?" Petrov demanded, watching his defensive positions come under coordinated assault. "More than us," came the grim reply from one of his lieutenants. In the chaos, I saw my opportunity. While the Russians focused on repelling Alessandro's attack, I moved toward the corner where Marco's family was held. The cage was secured with electronic locks, but I'd spent enough time in Alessandro's medical wing to recognize the access panel design. Rosa appeared beside me like a ghost, having used the assault to slip inside unnoticed. "The lock system is connected to the main power grid," she whispered. "If we can create a power surge in the right location, all electronic systems will reset for approximately 60 seconds. I looked at my medical bag, remembering the portable defibrillator I'd packed for trauma emergencies. "Can you get me to the main electrical panel?" Rosa's smile was fierce. "Follow me." We moved through the warehouse like ghosts, using the battle raging around us as cover. Alessandro's men were systematically destroying Petrov's defensive positions, but the Russians were fighting with the desperation of people who knew surrender meant death. Bullets sparked off concrete walls and shattered equipment as both sides engaged in urban warfare that would have done credit to professional armies. The electrical panel was located in a maintenance room near the building's center, protected by 2 guards who were more focused on the battle outside than potential sabotage inside. Rosa handled them with efficiency that spoke of extensive training, her movements fluid and deadly as she rendered both unconscious without raising an alarm. 30 seconds after the surge," Rosa said, as I prepared the defibrillator. "That's how long we have to get the family out and reach the extraction point." I charged the device to maximum output and connected the leads directly to the main power bus. "Where's the extraction point?" "Loading dock 3. Alessandro's men will be there." Rosa checked her watch. "Ready?" I triggered the defibrillator's discharge directly into the electrical system, sending thousands of volts racing through circuits designed for standard voltage. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every light in the building went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness broken only by emergency lighting and the muzzle flashes of ongoing gunfire. We ran through the confusion toward Marco's family, the electronic locks clicking open as their power supply failed. The woman Maria, I remembered from Rosa's photos, looked up at us with eyes that had given up hope weeks ago. "We're getting you out," I said, helping her to her feet while Rosa gathered the children. "Your brother sent us." But as we moved toward the loading dock, I realized the battle had shifted. Alessandro's assault had been too successful, too coordinated. Petrov's men were collapsing faster than expected, and in their desperation, they were becoming unpredictable. "The nurse." Petrov's voice cut through the chaos as emergency lighting illuminated our movement. "Kill Toretti's little pet!" Gunfire erupted around us, forcing us to take cover behind industrial equipment. In the strobing light of weapons fire, I saw Alessandro himself leading a group of his men toward our position. Even in tactical gear, even in the middle of a firefight, he moved with that same controlled grace I'd watched him use to intimidate enemies, and gentle enough to comfort me after nightmares. Our eyes met across the warehouse floor, and for a moment, the battle seemed to pause. Then Petrov appeared behind him, pistol raised toward Alessandro's unprotected back. I moved without thinking, my medical training taking over. The scalpel from my bag flew with the precision of someone who'd spent years making exact incisions, catching Petrov in the throat with surgical accuracy. He dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering across the concrete floor. Alessandro spun toward the sound, saw Petrov's body, then looked back at me with an expression that contained surprise, admiration, and something deeper that I wasn't ready to name. "The family," I called over the diminishing gunfire. "They're safe, But even as Alessandro's men secured the warehouse, even as Rosa reunited with her brother's wife and children, I realized that everything had changed again. I just killed a man to protect Alessandro. Not in self-defense, not in the heat of panic, but with cold medical precision because I couldn't bear to watch him die, which meant that despite everything I'd discovered about my father, despite every lie and manipulation, despite my determination to walk away from his world, I was still completely, irrevocably in love with Alessandro Torretti, and judging by the way he was looking at me as he crossed the warehouse floor, stepping over the bodies of his enemies to reach me, he knew it too. The war was over. But the real battle for our future was just beginning. 3 months after the warehouse battle, I stood in front of a mirror in what had once been the guest cottage and was now officially my home, adjusting the silk dress that Alessandro had chosen for tonight's dinner. The reflection staring back at me was someone I barely recognized. The exhausted, frightened nurse who'd stumbled into the wrong hospital room had been replaced by a woman who moved with quiet confidence through a world of power and violence. The physical changes were obvious. The dark circles under my eyes had disappeared, replaced by the glow that came from regular meals, proper sleep, and the kind of security I'd never known existed. But the deeper transformation was something that showed in my posture, in the way I held my head, in the casual efficiency with which I now handled medical emergencies that would have once left me shaking. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Come in." Alessandro entered, and even after 3 months of waking up beside him, the sight of him in a perfectly tailored tuxedo still made my breath catch. He moved with that same controlled grace I remembered from our first meeting, but now there was something different in his eyes when he looked at me. The calculating assessment had been replaced by something warmer, more possessive, more real. "You look beautiful, Principessa," he said, crossing the room to stand behind me. His hands settled on my shoulders, fingers tracing the line of my collarbone with familiar intimacy. "Are you ready for tonight?" Tonight was the official dinner to introduce me to the heads of the other families, the formal acknowledgement of my position as Alessandro's partner in both life and business. Over the past 3 months, I'd slowly been integrated into the operational side of the Torretti empire, starting with the medical facilities and expanding into the legitimate businesses that formed the public face of the organization. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. "Are you sure about this, Alessandro? There's still time to change your mind, to keep things unofficial." His arms circled my waist, pulling me closer. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You saved my life, Sophia. You saved Marco's family. You eliminated the Russian threat when you killed Petrov." His lips brushed against my ear. "You're not just my medical advisor anymore, you're my equal partner in everything." The word equal sent warmth through me. It had taken 3 months of careful negotiation and gradual trust building, but Alessandro had slowly ceded real authority to me. I now oversaw all medical operations for the family, managed the legitimate healthcare businesses that served as fronts for money laundering, and had a vote in strategic decisions that affected the organization's future. But more than that, I'd found my purpose in ways I'd never expected. The network of clinics we'd established served both the criminal world and the legitimate community, providing healthcare to people who couldn't afford it elsewhere. I was still saving lives, just not in the way I'd originally imagined. "Mrs. Chen says the other families have already arrived," Alessandro continued, his reflection meeting mine in the mirror. "Don Marco from Chicago, the Costellos from Philadelphia, even the Yakuza representatives from the West Coast." I turned in his arms, studying the face I'd grown to love despite everything he represented. "And they'll accept me? They'll accept what I tell them to accept." Alessandro's voice carried that edge of authority that had once terrified me and now provided comfort. "But Sophia, you need to understand what tonight means. Once this dinner happens, once you're formally recognized as my partner, there's no going back to your old life. Ever." I reached up to straighten his bow tie, a gesture that had become automatic over the past months. "I walked away from my old life the night I chose to save you instead of running. The night I chose to become someone who could kill when necessary, instead of just heal." Alessandro caught my hands, bringing them to his lips to press kisses against my palms. "No regrets?" I thought about that question as we walked through the mansion toward the main dining room. No regrets about the luxury that surrounded me now. The security that meant I never had to worry about money or safety again. No regrets about the work I was doing, the lives I was saving through our network of medical facilities. No regrets about falling in love with a man who would destroy anyone who threatened me. But there were complexities I was still learning to navigate. The weight of authority that came with making life and death decisions for an organization that employed hundreds of people. The careful balance between the legitimate businesses and the criminal activities that funded them. The knowledge that my hands, which had once only been used for healing, were now capable of violence when necessary. The main dining room had been transformed for tonight's gathering. Crystal glasses caught the light from chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses, while the table had been set with china that belonged in museums. But it was the guests that commanded attention, 12 men and 3 women, who represented the most powerful criminal organizations on the East Coast. Alessandro's hand found the small of my back as we entered, a gesture of both support and possession. Conversations quieted as attention focused on us, and I felt the weight of assessment from people who were accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities with surgical precision. "Gentlemen, ladies," Alessandro said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Sofia Montenegro, my partner in all business matters, and the woman who will be taking over medical operations for our collective interests." The title doctor was a strategic choice we'd made together. While I wasn't technically a physician, my expanded role in the organization's medical networks justified the upgrade, and it carried more authority in rooms like this than nurse would have. Don Marco Castellano, a man in his 70s whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, rose from his seat. "Miss Montenegro, your reputation precedes you. Alessandro tells us you eliminated Viktor Petrov personally." "The situation required immediate action," I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. Mr. Petrov posed a direct threat to organizational stability. Something that might have been approval flickered in the old man's eyes. Spoken like someone who understands business necessities. "Welcome to the family, Dr. Montenegro." The dinner that followed was an education in power dynamics that no medical school could have provided. Conversations flowed between legitimate business concerns and thinly veiled discussions of territorial disputes, while I found myself contributing insights about healthcare regulations that could affect money laundering operations and medical infrastructure that could serve multiple organizational needs. But it was during dessert that the real test came. "Dr. Montenegro," said Elena Yakuza, one of the few other women in the room and someone whose delicate appearance masked a reputation for extraordinary violence. "There are rumors that you were reluctant to join this life, that Alessandro had to convince you to accept your current position." The room went quiet, everyone understanding that this was more than casual conversation. Elena was testing whether I was truly committed to this world, or still harboring thoughts of returning to civilian life. "Mrs. Yakuza," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. 3 months ago, I was a hospital nurse working double shifts to pay my sister's college tuition. Tonight, I'm sitting at a table with the most powerful people on the Eastern Seaboard, with the authority to make decisions that affect thousands of lives. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. Reluctance and commitment aren't mutually exclusive. The question isn't whether I chose this life willingly, but whether I've proven myself worthy of the trust you're all placing in me. Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. "And have you? Ask the 47 doctors and nurses now employed in our medical network. Ask the 3,000 patients who've received treatment in our clinics this quarter. Ask Viktor Petrov." I kept my voice calm, professional. "Oh, wait. You can't ask him. He's dead." The laughter that followed was genuine, breaking the tension and signaling acceptance in ways that no formal vote could have achieved. But it was Alessandro's expression that mattered most to me. The pride and satisfaction in his eyes, as he watched me hold my own in a room full of people who could order deaths with a whisper. Later, as the guests departed and we stood on the mansion's front steps, watching their motorcades disappear into the night, Alessandro pulled me close against the evening chill. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like Sofia Montenegro just officially died," I replied honestly, "and Dr. Sofia Toretti was born." Alessandro's sharp intake of breath told me he'd caught the significance of the name change I'd implied. We hadn't discussed marriage formally, but tonight had made it clear that our partnership was permanent in ways that went beyond business arrangements. Sophia Toretti, he repeated, testing the sound of it. I liked the way that sounds. As we walked back into the mansion that had become home, past the medical wing where I'd save lives tomorrow, and the study where I'd help plan operations that might end them, I realized that I'd found something I'd never known I was looking for. Not just love, not just security, but purpose that used every part of who I was, the healer, the protector, the woman capable of both infinite compassion and necessary violence. The girl who'd entered the wrong hospital room 6 months ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone who could walk between worlds, who could save lives in the morning and eliminate threats in the evening, who could be both Alessandro's equal partner and his greatest strength. I'd found my place in his darkness, and he'd found his light in my healing hands. Together, we'd built something that was greater than either of us alone, an empire that balanced violence with mercy, power with responsibility, love with the kind of loyalty that could withstand anything the world threw at us. And as Alessandro's arms tightened around me in our bedroom, in our home, in our shared future, I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where I belonged.